Alrighty, hello everybody. I have 0 people in person, so thank you all for signing on Zoom. It's an interesting day. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the captions on our Google Slides here, and I'm just going to dive right into the many-trait approach. Again, I haven't looked at your exams yet. I plan to do so this weekend. Since no one else is here, I'm going to turn off the big fan thing. Alrighty, so we're just gonna go ahead and go through the rest of this lecture, and then on Monday we do have another discussion day. So I'm gonna try to turn this a little bit so I can focus more on y'all. So we were talking about the many-trait approach, and if you remember, we watched the little marshmallow delay of gratification video at the end of class on Wednesday. So delay of gratification is denying oneself immediate pleasure for long-term gain. And you all are very familiar with this because you are doing this right now. College students delay gratification because you all have to go through 4 years in order to get the degree that'll help you get the job you want or help you get into the grad school you want. Hey, welcome. Yay, there's someone in person. Make yourself comfy. All righty, so just talking about delay of gratification and how y'all do it, because everybody delays starting their career to do college so that they can get the job that they want. So there are some sex differences that have been found in research about delay of gratification. So males have a harder time delaying than females. And delay of gratification in girls, so ages 3 to 10, 3 to 11, correlates with things like intelligence, competence, attentiveness, and resourcefulness. And in boys of the same age, it correlates with shyness, quietness, compliance, and anxiousness. And then in both girls and boys, it correlates with planfulness. That makes sense. If you're going to delay gratification, it makes sense that someone who would be more planful would be, those traits seem to really go together, right? And then reflectiveness also makes sense. If you can delay gratification, you could take that moment to delay. And then reasonableness. Also related to concepts like ego control. Ego control is self-control or inhibition. Again, makes sense with delay of gratification. And that's in kids of all genders. And then ego resiliency is related to delay only in girls. And ego resiliency is essentially like your level of psychological adjustment, how much you can bounce back from any sort of mental health issue. Interesting, delay of gratification can also predict things in the future. So drug abuse, for example, can be predicted by several characteristics rated about 10 years prior. And then depression. Risk factors for women include things like over-control and being shy and reserved. And then risk factors for men include under control. So you could see women maybe having high on delay of gratification, men having low. And again, these are generalities. Certainly within each of those, there would be gender variation and individual variation. Then there's the essential trait approach. And this approach asks which of the traits are most important, which really matter. So you take all the traits and you try to reduce them down. And there are theoretical approaches to this. So Murray, for example, came up with the idea of 20 needs, that he made the 20 most important traits, basically. And then Block came up with the ideas of ego control and ego resiliency that we just talked about. However, the largest percentage of research done in this area and of how these are constructed is actually through factor analytic approaches. So Eysenck, it was one of the big names here. And just to back up a second to remind us what factor analysis is, for factor analysis, you get a bunch of items, or in the case of trait research, it's often just like the names of a bunch of traits. Like original people like Cattell went through dictionaries to find names of traits. You have people respond to them, and then you tell your statistical program, hey, please tell me if these make up a smaller number of traits, if they group together, or the statistical term we use is hang together. And so Eysenck found 3. He's found extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Eysenck was also still theoretical, even though he was using factor analysis, because he based his model on the idea that important traits should be heritable. We should see them run in families. So there's an emphasis on social role and an insistence that the things he studied be observable. So that's also a distinction from some of the other folks we'll talk about, so that he wanted to behaviorally observe those traits. And I'm just gonna, give me a second, Zoom people. There's like one of the slides that's right now, and he must have a seizure. So I'm just gonna do that. Much, much, much better. Okay. Alrighty. And so psychoticism was a blend of aggressiveness, creativity, and impulsiveness for Eysenck. Neuroticism was emotional reactivity and emotionality. And then extroversion was sociability and impulsiveness. And in fact, neuroticism and extroversion, so the first 2 on this list here, have been found so often in various research studies that these are sometimes just called the big 2 personality traits. So we see those come up in a lot of different constellations of personality traits we find through factor analysis. So it seems like those might be some of the most consistent. Tellegen looked at positive emotionality, negative emotionality, and constraints. Alka Tellegen is actually one of the co-authors of the recent versions of the MMPI, so the MMPI 2RF and the MMPI 3, along with my grad school professor, Yossi Ben-Porath. And you can see his influence actually in the way the MMPI 3 and 2RF were constructed. And Eysenck and Tellegen found pretty similar results. But Tellegen's wasn't really, theoretical in the same way. It was more looking at the data. And then Cattell came up with 16 essential traits. This is why he created the 16 PF that we talked about earlier in the semester. And recently, some people have been like, that's too many traits. So it's controversial now. He collected huge amount of data. Like I mentioned previously, he would go through dictionaries and, well, he probably made his students go through dictionaries and find names of traits and use those for the basis of his research. He also looked at behavior in everyday settings, as well as getting some lab data with psychophysical measurements. So this would be things like heart rate, skin conductance, things along those lines. I don't think at Cattell's time they were to the point of testing cortisol, but nowadays that's what they would do. So cortisol is a marker of stress, and you can get it pretty easily by basically having someone spit into a tube and then analyzing it. So modern day research, if Cattell was still doing it, would probably include that. And as we've mentioned previously in this class, the one that is most commonly accepted in this day and age is the Big Five. And so the Big Five were discovered via what's called the lexical hypothesis. And the idea from the lexical hypothesis is that important aspects of our lives will be labeled with words. And if something's truly important and universal, there's going to be lots of words for it in lots of different languages. So again, this is looking for traits that have the most words and are the most universal across the languages. I've since learned that this is a little bit of a myth, but Native Alaskan people who stereotypically have been called Eskimos, they have many words for snow, for example, because that's an important part of their life, but apparently not as many as people were originally saying. So, but the things that are important in our lives, we have more words for. And then they do factor analysis based on this. And the really interesting about the big five, and I believe I do have the actual traits here on the coming slides, the ocean, is that these are orthogonal or unrelated. How you score on one doesn't influence how you score on the other. So you could be a person who scores really high on extroversion and low on neuroticism, or you could be a person who scores really high on extroversion and high on neuroticism, right? So they're not interdependent, although certainly sometimes they're correlated in certain studies. It can bring order to many research findings, particularly if the findings are consistent with a particular trait. And the big five are more complex than they seem at first. The labels are admittedly oversimplified and potentially misleading. And so we're going to flesh those out more. So the first one, again, we're going in the ocean order to help you all remember them, is openness to experience. This is also sometimes referred to as intellect. And for that reason, it's the most controversial trait, because intellect isn't a personality trait. It's like a neuropsychological measure, right? So it's instead how you approach intellectual matters, or might have some elements of basic intelligence. It's also about how you value culture and cultural matters, things like art, things like literature. It's also about creativity and perceptiveness. This is one of the ones that is least replicable across different samples, and particularly across different cultures. Often we'll find 5 traits in cultures, but like openness to experience won't be one of them. It seems to be pretty specific to, say, Western individualistic cultures. All of these are related to like some positive life outcomes and some negative. And so here we have potential for drug use, which like doesn't have to be super negative unless you get addicted, right? And then positive things like artistic interests. People who are high on this are viewed by others as creative, open-minded, and clever. Another fun thing about openness to experience is if you're high on this, it's actually linked to being more hypnotizable. I guess because you're like more open to the idea you could be hypnotized. I am very hypnotizable, and I like to think it's because I'm high on this and not because I'm hopeful. My grad school professor, Dr. Dowd, may he rest in peace, he passed a couple of years ago. He would often use me for demonstrations because I'm very hypnotizable. He studied hypnosis and how we combine it with modern therapies to help people with things like pain. Conscientiousness are things like responsibility, consistency, moral reasoning. We can think of this as being related to like the superego from Freud, but it's more than that. It's also about like wanting things done in a very like particular and fastidious way. If you use conscientiousness in employee selection, it actually will predict supervisor ratings of job performance, favorable ratings, pretty highly, which is cool. And the opposite of it, low conscientiousness predicts absenteeism and employee theft. You're not very conscientious, you don't really care, right? And then again, high conscientiousness predicts good job performance, low conscientiousness predicts bad job performance. This tends to be less biased than if you give people like aptitude tests or some of like I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, like applying for what seems like it shouldn't be that complicated of a job. Like when I worked at Kohl's, I had to fill out this weird like personality inventory about multitasking before they hired me. This is much more accurate. It also predicts success in college, and it predicts success in college better than SAT scores and better than even high school GPA. Just whether or not you're conscientious will predict how well you do in college, because so much of college you have to sort of self-guide, right? You're not spending as much time in class. You have a lot more outside of class work that's assigned. However, it is not related to IQ, which again talks about it being orthogonal with openness to experience. Some people argue that conscientiousness might be a big driver behind how we can explain motivation in general. It does predict longer life expectancy, likely because you will like follow your doctor's health advice, right? Things like that. And it's positively correlated with years of schooling. So for example, people who get PhDs are gonna have higher levels of conscientiousness in a lot of cases than people who drop out of high school. Extroversion. This is being social, outgoing, active, outspoken, dominant, and adventurous. A lot of advantages here. Extroverted people often have higher status and are rated as more popular and physically attractive, even if they are objectively about as attractive as someone who's more introverted. People also have more positive emotions towards folks who have extroversion, high extroversion. The disadvantage is mate poaching. So this is essentially cheating, or like kind of locking down the good people that you're interested in, things along those lines. But in terms of life outcomes, these folks who are high on extroversion tend to be happy, grateful, have a long life, tend to be more healthy, and have more successful relationships. But of course, that doesn't mean that all of them do. Agreeableness, conformity and compliance. Again, the negative aspects here, but also positive aspects of likability and warmth. So these folks tend to be cooperative and easy to get along with. These are the folks you would want on your sports team with you or in a group project, things along those lines. And then there's some really interesting correlates, like they smoke less. So that shows you that the compliance isn't totally that, right? Women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men, largely because it is more sort of socially programmed for women to be compliant than for men. Among children, agreeableness is unfortunately related to, or actually agreeableness is related to less vulnerability of being bullied, probably because they're just like, okay, sure, you're taking my lunch money. And then in terms of life outcomes, people who are higher on agreeableness are more likely to be psychologically well-adjusted, have a healthy heart, and have dating satisfaction. And then there's neuroticism. Now, this has always been really interesting to me, that neuroticism is the only one of the big five that, like, the way we talk about it, the way it's labeled, is skewed in the negative direction. So, I mean, you could have called this something, like mental health or like a healthy personality and talked about the other end, but they chose to focus in on the negative aspects. So emotional instability, the traditional use of the word neuroticism or neurotic often referred to anxiety and depression. People who are high on neuroticism have trouble with problem solving. They have strong negative reactions to stress. It's negatively correlated with happiness, well-being, and physical health. There's a general tendency towards psychopathology if you're high on neuroticism. And in terms of life outcomes for those who are high on this factor, problems in family relationships, being dissatisfied with their jobs, and even in extreme cases, criminal behavior. So here are some of the names by which the Big Five have been called in various studies. So it does, again, seem to come up with consistently very similar traits, although sometimes, again, you're going to see fewer, right? So this one only had 3 or 4 you were looking at. But yeah, the idea that, Extroversion might be called assertiveness in certain studies, or power. Agreeableness might be called conformity, or it might be called likability, right? And those have different implications. Conscientiousness could just be called will to achieve or responsibility. Neuroticism could also just be called emotionality or emotional control. And then openness to experience is sometimes just referred to as like culture or intellect as well. And here you see, like, these are the most simplified versions. Power, agreeableness would be love. Work for conscientiousness, affect, which is just a fancy word for emotion, and intellect. So as long as you're looking within a Western sample, you're going to pretty much find these same 5 traits. However, when you translate it to other languages, different things happen. So if you take like a Big 5 inventory and you translate it to the other language, so you take the one we came up with in America, and you're like, I'm going to test this in China. So you translate it to Chinese and you do all the proper things you're supposed to do, like back translate to make sure it still goes. What we find is that we find 4 or 5 of the factors reappear out of the Big 5. But if we start with the lexical approach in the native language, if we basically kind of go back to Cattell and look through dictionaries and things like that, we find overlap, but not a one-to-one correspondence. So we should probably be pretty hesitant about just applying our Westernized views to other cultures. I know that's a novel concept for people who aren't, you know, the folks that you are. So Yang and Bond looked at the Big 5 in different cultures. In particular, they looked at Taiwan. And they found, not shockingly, that different cultures are different. What? And that within a culture, there's an enormous variation in individual people and how they're going to respond to the Big 5 or various personality things. Each culture also uses different words to study people's personalities. And Yang and Bond were kind of like, where do we come off? Just taking our theories and trying to apply it to other cultures. So we really need to think about this in terms of nomothetic, you know, again, that name definition level. This is universal versus idiographic, right? And we should be using an idiographic approach for each culture, but then also for individuals within that culture. So here are Yang and Bond's, the way they found the factors in Taiwan and how they related to the sort of Westernized Big 5. And then Goldberg put each of the Big 5 into a question. I don't know how useful that is. He's still just using terms, right? But that's what's in the middle column. So for openness to experience, Yang and Bond found in Taiwanese sample, you had things like social orientation, competence, incompetence, whatever has the star correlated the highest with that particular Big 5 trait. So competence, incompetence for openness, if we're thinking about it in terms of intellect, okay, that makes sense, right? Expressiveness and self-control. Conscientiousness, what correlated the most is self-control. Again, if we're thinking about it in terms of responsibility, that makes sense. But also social orientation and that competence and competence was related. Extroversion was related to expressiveness, which is really interesting because just from a like take it away intellectual point of view, that feels more like a neuroticism to me, but you know, that's what correlated with it in this Taiwanese sample, but also social orientation. And you see that social orientation really came into play in a lot of these. And that's because Taiwan, like a lot of East Asian cultures, is more collectivistic than the individualistic Western society. So for agreeableness, social orientation makes sense, but also self-control. And then competence, incompetence, and expressiveness. And then neuroticism was the only one that was linked to optimism and neuroticism, but it was actually competence and incompetence that it related to the most. So the idea unfortunately, a stereotype, I think, of like people with poor mental health being incompetent, right? We also know that there are different life outcomes associated with the various personality traits, in terms of like how you feel about yourself, how you feel about your connections with other people, and institutional outcomes. So people high on extroversion have more happiness, gratitude, longevity, and physical health. Interpersonally, peers accept them more. They have more success in dating and relationships. They're considered more attractive. They have higher status. They have satisfaction with their jobs. They're involved in their community more and often in leadership roles. Agreeableness is linked to things like religious involvement, ability to forgive other people, which like that would be an interesting, like those three variables to study, like how they relate, because obviously religious involvement is often linked to forgiveness as well. Humor, heart health and longevity, and psychological health, peer acceptance and dating satisfaction. There's related to social interests, getting a job, and avoiding criminal behavior. And then conscientiousness is linked again to religious beliefs, good health habits and longevity, avoiding drug abuse, family and dating satisfaction, job performance, occupational success, political conservatism. Again, if we think about responsibility and sort of the misideas people get within politics, that people who get help are not responsible, right? Even though sometimes getting help for your family is the most responsible thing you can do anyway. But then avoidance of criminal behavior, neuroticism, correlated with the not good things, unhappiness, poor coping, poor family relations, dissatisfaction with your jobs, the unsatisfaction, and criminal behavior. Woohoo! And then openness is related to forgiveness and inspiration, but also substance abuse. Again, open to try new things. And artistic interests and political liberalism. So again, interesting things that can be linked. But again, just, I think one thing that like a lot of people fall into, and even people who research this, is just thinking like that these are dichotomies, like you have it or you don't, right? But in fact, you would fall on a scale, a dimension on each of these, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. It's not like I have one agreeableness. It's like, how agreeable are you? Alrighty, so there are also studies and criticisms beyond the Big Five. Some have argued they're not totally orthogonal like they should be, because you know, there is some link, and even with the outcomes, you saw some of them overlapped, right? And that there's more to personality than just these 5 things. Fair, right? And they try to argue that it's too broad for conceptual understanding, and that you're trying to essentially like characterize or shoehorn other traits into these 5. So something like authoritarianism that we talked about earlier, trying to think of that as a combination of Big 5 traits can leave out important concepts and the essence of that particular trait. Like there's nothing in the Big 5 that would talk about like acquiescence with authority in the same way, like agreeableness a little, but not really. There's also this potential for a typological approach to personality. And this is based on doubts about whether it's valid to compare people quantitatively on the same trait dimensions. The idea is, are we just turning people into numbers? And is that ethical? Instead, they sort the patterns of traits into what they call types. And they argue that important differences between people may instead be qualitative, something we can't quantify with numbers, but that we can describe. So some challenges here would be to find the divisions that distinguish the different types and to come up with X number of basic types that describe the whole of humanity, right? Like that's a little bit of a challenge. And there are three replicable types that we see over and over in research that looked at these. One is well-adjusted. These are people who are adaptive, flexible, resourceful, and successful interpersonally. Maladjusted over-controlling are essentially type A, or there's a disorder called OCPD, or if you think of Freud's anal stage, people who are too uptight, difficult to deal with, and might even deny themselves pleasure. And then there's maladjusted under-controlling. And that is being too impulsive, engaging potentially in dangerous activities, and that can wreak havoc on yourself and on other people. And types do not predict behavior beyond what can be predicted with quantitative trait scores. So it's like by doing this extra work and coming up with types and describing people qualitatively, like, are we getting any more helpful information? Maybe not. So is it useful to think about people in terms of types? Yes, maybe. It's basically a summary of how you stand on several traits. And it makes it easier to think about how traits within a person interact with each other. But is it like magically simplifying things? No. So general criticisms of the trait approach. People argue that these factors are abstractions and they might not have meaning in the way we think they do in day-to-day life. Part of what happens when you get really mired into research like this is you kind of just talk about the concepts and the constructs and their relationships, and you kind of miss sometimes that like these are people that we're talking about, right? And so you need to kind of like take that step back for yourself sometimes. What are the implications for this? People argue factor analysis doesn't add anything to the data. Well, it's not supposed to, right? It's supposed to take what is there in the data and make sense of it, what relates to each other. Some people argue it's premature to try to quantify things in this area, and that might be fair. Psychology is a very young science. We're still trying to figure this stuff out. But then like the counter argument is, okay, but when do we decide when it's mature, right? When do we decide when we can do this? And how do we get there if we're not already trying to do some of this research? A really important point here is that development isn't addressed. So we don't talk at all about how we get to those particular traits. It's just sort of like you have them. So we don't talk about like what happens in childhood or adolescence or does trauma affect these or anything like that. This is a very valid criticism. Also, the trait approach is relatively static. So it argues that like people are the same throughout their lives. And both data and honestly just common sense suggest that individual difference variables don't operate like that. That people actually do grow and change throughout their lives. And there are subtle interactions within different variables and within different traits. And trait theorists fully acknowledge this problem. And it's something that they're working on studying. Another big argument here is that kind of going off of that idea is that people can be inconsistent, right? And personality traits are not the only factors that control behavior. Situations are also very important. And I think the vast majority of personality theorists wouldn't argue against that, right? And in fact, I remember having a textbook in grad school that was called The Person and the Situation, right? Like fully acknowledging these things are going to interact. So, I think what a trait theorist would argue is like, how does the situation bring out that trait in someone? But some people who are against the trait approach sort of say, no, the situations are more important. Some people have argued, do traits even exist, or is this just something we've made up? I mean, you could say that for any psychological construct, right? But just something to think about. Some people have argued, is everyone basically the same and our behavior just changes according to that situation? When we get to particularly evolutionary psychology theories of personality, this will come back up. The idea that like kind of everybody is the same. Trait stability does increase with age and is related to psychological adjustments. So, you know, that could go either way in terms of like, well, if it changes over time, is it a thing? But also maybe as you get more confident in your own self and your own personality, then these traits solidify. For Monday, y'all are going to be doing a reading by Michel. And he is very anti-trait. And so what he argues is that behavior is too inconsistent across situations for individual differences to be characterized by traits. And you'll be reading some other people who would disagree with Michel as well. So we need to be thinking about persons, situations, but also people's values, right? That's going to really impact it. People are technically free to do whatever they want, right? If we focus in on situationism, people can react to any given situation in, I don't know, many, many different ways. In some situations, probably infinite ways. The idea is that everybody's equal and that differences are a function of the situation. And that is, you know, again, in opposition to the trait approach, which would say some people based on their traits are more likely to have bad outcomes. It also looks at personality's view of human nature so that people can develop consistent identities and styles that allow them to be themselves across situations. And again, trait approach doesn't answer how do we get there, right? How do we make those choices and are they conscious or unconscious? So how do we resolve the person situation debate? Funder says people maintain their personalities even as they adapt their behavior to particular situations. Right down the middle, right? And I think that that's really true. I think in psychology, a lot of times we need to be considering a very comprehensive approach. Like the model I think we should be using is the biopsychosocial model, right? Where we're incorporating biological things, socialization, but also our psychological factors to explain things. People can flexibly adapt to situations, but they have a generally consistent personal style. So people are psychologically different, and those differences matter. All righty. That is everything I have for today. So we got through it a little more quickly than I anticipated. So I will let everybody go a little early. Zoom folks, if you don't mind staying on for just a minute, I'm gonna make sure I check off everybody who came in. And then you can be on your way. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. And if not, have a good weekend. Alrighty, and y'all can sign off. Thanks. You have a good day too, Elijah.